told you. Isn't that an inspiring title? Well, I'm going to have a tan. All right. Well, let's move on into this and see what we got here. So, let me tell y'all, this slide really sums things up in a nutshell when it comes to gardening. Our job as gardeners is to learn the preferences of our plants and provide them with what they need to be healthy. Now, who does it sound like is in charge of that? Yeah. Who's providing what to whom? So as a gardener, if you ever thought you were in charge, who is catering to whose needs? Who's doing everything for the other? Now, plants give us back something. They give us back all kinds of things. Things that we can talk about, things that we can't talk about, things that we can see, and things that we can't see. They give us all kinds of wonderful things. Food for our table, flowers for our vases. But they demand from us as well. And so as gardeners, we have to be able to accept that our job is to cater to the needs of these plants to the best of our ability. Like being parents. You know, being a gardener is kind of like you have the same sort of nurturing things going on. Plants are adaptable, but they will not thrive if you push them beyond their basic preferences. And you've got to match the preferences of the plant to the growing conditions where you planted. So notice, we've got what the plant wants and what we need to do to make sure it gets it. And that's the basis of successful gardening. It is not any more complicated than that. It is not any more complicated than that. And let me tell you, that is incredibly complicated. Sounds simple, but it's very complicated. As I mentioned earlier, a committee of horticulturists did not get together, decades ago and come up with a list of plants and say, okay, what kind of light does this plant like? And what kind of light does this plant like? And what kind of drainage does this plant like? I mean, we had to find out what the plants liked themselves and then provide it to them. And the hints that we got on what these plants would prefer come from here. Every garden plant you have in your landscape grew in the wild or grows in the wild. Somewhere in the world there are no landscape plants that just pop up in the nurseries. These are all wild plants that we bring into cultivation. The growing conditions they need once we bring them into cultivation are very similar to what they had in their native habitat. That requirement for that environment is imprinted in their genes. They cannot change it. Again, if it's a plant adapted to growing in the shade, you cannot talk it into growing in the sun. You can't tell it how beautiful it looks in that spot and how special you would consider if it would just grow there for you. If it's too much sun, it can't. Same thing for the shade. You can put a plant in the shade and talk to it and bring it jewelry and fertilize it and play Beethoven for it. You can do anything you want for it and it won't make any difference. So if we push plants beyond their preference, if we plant them in a spot where the drainage isn't good enough, the light isn't good enough, or something else is not appropriate, we will tend to fail with that plant no matter what else we do. So again, plants are genetically adapted to specific growing conditions, and we either discover that through research or trial and error. And let me tell you, it's very expensive to discover what plants like through trial and error. Very expensive, I can tell you. All right. So we have our overall climate, and this is the climate that we live in. So our temperatures, how hot does it get in the summertime? How long does it stay hot? How cold does it get in the wintertime typically? And we'll talk about hardiness zones, which focus on cold, and heat zones, which focus on heat in just a little bit. So temperature, how cold and how hot it is, has a profound effect on the plants that we use. Rainfall also has a profound effect. We live in a wet climate. Our climate is mild, wet. We have mild climate with, well, it doesn't feel mild right now, but it's a mild climate. It's a warm, wet climate. We have a warm, wet climate in the southeast. We have a warm, dry climate in the southwest. So even though our temperatures may be similar across the southeast and the southwest, our rainfall is very different. So we could never successfully grow many of the plants that grow well in New Mexico and Colorado, and they could never grow plants that thrive here without running their water bills up to what they'd pay to send their kid to college. So It's this rainfall amount also. And when it occurs, there are plants that are native to climates where the winters are dry. The Mediterranean climate has a relatively dry winter. And plants that are native to dry winter areas are rarely successful here. Caladiums are native to dry winter areas. When it's winter time for the caladiums, they go dormant and it stops raining. It's really not the winter, it's just the dry season. So when we try to plant caladiums here and we leave them in the ground over the winter, the ground never freezes. They don't die from the cold. They die because it rains all winter long here and the tubers rot in the ground. So again, if a plant likes a dry winter, we don't have dry winters. It makes them a challenge to grow here. So again, finding out more about where the plant's native habitat is, what it likes in the wild, will give you some hints and indications about it. Soil type, the pH of the soil, the texture of the soil. When it comes to the soil, we also look at things like drainage. And so this can have a real big effect on what kind of plants we can grow, what kind of soil is in your area of the state or in your neighborhood or where you garden. What characteristics does it have? Now, we can modify these to some degree. We can cover plants up in the winter time. I knew of a gentleman, orchid fancier in New Orleans, that wanted to grow cool growing orchids, so he built a greenhouse and air conditioned it. And it was kept in the 70s during the day and the 60s, upper 50s at night. Can you imagine? He was well off. You have to pay to do that. So he was providing the coolness that the plants needed. So we can modify this depending on how much trouble we're willing to go to. We can water if we need to. Now it's hard to take water away. That's why we don't succeed well with plants that like dry climates that much. But it's best to work with what you've got. When you try to change the growing conditions or when you try to push the limits of the plant, that's when they become more trouble to take care of, more trouble to be successful with, and more work. So the more you work with the natural conditions that are there, and if you've got a low area that tends to stay damp, choose plants that like low areas that tend to stay damp. Don't put a plant that likes perfect drainage and attempt to put a French drainage system in, or spend $500 to put all kinds of fill and things and build up beds. It's always nice to work with what you've got. Nature is easiest to work with when you are cooperating with nature rather than fighting. All right, looking at minimum temperatures, hardy versus tender. You see, when you think about things over and over again, you finally begin to learn them. If you think about something once, you will never learn it. So I'm hitting you with these two words, hardy and tender, over and over again. And when you see them, you should begin to think, oh, I'm kind of beginning to know what hardy and tender mean. So remember, hardy means that it will reliably survive the winter where you garden without a lot of effort. Tender means it will not reliably survive the winter where you garden, unless you go to a lot of effort to protect it. Again, this is only an issue when we decide we're going to grow these wonderful tropical crinums that will freeze if it gets down to the low 20s or teens. I loved that plant as long as it survived before the cold got it. And oftentimes when we have plants like that, we do have to say goodbye to them on occasion. All right, how many of you heard of hardiness zones and heat zones? Raise your hands. How many of you have a good understanding of hardiness and heat zones? I'll just skip this. Would you like me to skip it? Y'all know enough about it? Yes? Oh, y'all are saying yes. Y'all are so smart. Well, for me, let me go over it with y'all just to be sure. Where is Zone 8 in Louisiana? Let's see, y'all have a map in your handbook. Where is Zone 8 and where is Zone 9? And do you really have to look at a map to know? So if you live, this is the way I describe it to gardeners. If you live someplace in Louisiana and you're watching the news at night and the meteorologist comes on and says it's going to get down to 15 degrees tonight, if you jump up in your house robe and your slippers and you run outside and start wrapping your pipes and wrapping your faucets and covering your plants and panicking, then you live in Zone 9. Because we hardly ever get 15 degrees in Zone 9. Now, if you hear it's going to be 15 degrees at night and you sit back in your chair and you go, oh, did you hear it's going to be 15 degrees tonight? You live in Zone 8. Now, our parents lived in Shreveport, which is zone 8. I spent my gardening career in zone 9. And I'd go home for Christmas on occasion, and I'd be laying there in my pajamas watching the 10 o'clock news, and it would say 15 degrees, and I would literally jump off the floor in a panic, literally. And here my mom and dad sitting there in their easy chairs just reading the newspaper, and y'all, it's going to get to 15 degrees. We got to wrap the pipes, and what do you cover your plants with? And they go, it gets down to 15 degrees all the time up here. We're smart enough to put our pipes down in the ground in North Louisiana. So they had no worries. So again, if you live someplace where temperatures in the teens are the norm and they don't upset you that much, you live in zone 8. If you live someplace where temperatures in the teens are unusual and panic you, then you live in zone 9. That's as complicated as it is. That's as complicated as it is. Heat zones are also very interesting. Let's take a look at some of the maps. Now, here's a hardiness zone map, something really interesting that you're going to see. Now, notice I told you that temperature-wise, the humid southeast, the humid mild southeast, and the dry mild southwest have similar temperatures. You see that? The hardiness zones are similar, except when you get in the Rocky Mountains here. But it's a dryness. They get very little rain over here, and we get tons of rain in the Gulf coastal area. But here's something interesting. Notice how these mild zones, zone 8 and zone 9, run all the way up the west coast. Now, Baton Rouge is in zone 8, and Seattle is in zone 8. Has anybody ever been to Seattle or the Northwest at all? Does it look like us? It doesn't. It doesn't look anything like us. You may see a few of the same plants. Oh yeah, I recognize that, I know that. But when you look around at the landscapes, they look very different. It does not look like South Louisiana. They're in the same hardiness zone. They're in the same hardiness zone. Why in the world would Seattle look so different from Baton Rouge? Well, we're about to find out in a minute. So here's Louisiana right here. Here's a zone 8, crosses about the lower third of Louisiana, is in zone 9. And here we can see our Gulf coastal area. So we live and we garden in an area called the Deep South or the Gulf coastal South. The South is not good enough. If you get a book that's written for the South goes up way far from us. Virginians are almost Yankees as far as I'm concerned. So Virginia gardens are completely different from ours, and Virginia is in the South. So we are in the Gulf coastal South or the Deep South, and it runs from the panhandle of Florida all the way down past Houston, the Texas Gulf Coast. What part of it is most like us? Well, notice that here in Baton Rouge, we're right in the midst of zone 9 right here and zone 8. When you look at Mississippi, you'll notice there may be a tiny bit of zone 9 along the coast. Same thing with Alabama. Alabama and Mississippi have virtually no zone 9. Louisiana is a third to almost a half zone 9. So when you think about who we have a kinship, we don't have as much kinship with Mississippi and Alabama as we might think we do. We do have kinship with the Texas Gulf Coast. Their zone 9 climate in Houston is far more similar to us here than Montgomery, Alabama, or Jackson, Mississippi up there would be. So again, this is where we have more kinship, is down here in this area. And with the Panhandle and Upper Peninsula of Florida has a similar climate to ours here in South Louisiana as well. And just a close-up of the state, here is the dividing line between zone 8 and zone 9. You can see it dips down here and just barely doesn't clip Baton Rouge. The Florida parishes are all zone 8. Even though zone 9 occurs here at the same level, this is just a colder part of the state. Hammond is habitually colder than Baton Rouge. When we have freezes, Hammond is habitually colder than Baton Rouge. And so this area here is just a little bit colder than this area right over here. New Orleans, of course, is zone 9B, which is the warmest area in the state. We've got zone 9B here, and then along the coastal areas in zone 9B, it stays in the upper 20s on average. Now in New Orleans, it's gotten down to 11 degrees back in 1989. So again, just because on average in New Orleans it stays in the upper 20s. It doesn't mean there can't be exceptional periods of unusual cold that might occur. So the heat, as I've said several times, the rest of the country obsesses over hardiness. In Michigan, it's all about, will it survive our winters? What kind of a plant can live when the soil freezes solid down 2 feet deep, as it does in Michigan? Have you ever lived in a place where the soil froze? Yeah, it doesn't freeze here. It's really weird when you can't get a shovel in the soil because it's hard as a rock. Hard as a rock. Ground never freezes here, so we don't have to worry about that. That's why we garden year-round here. It's not the cold of winter that primarily determines the shrubs and ground covers and turf grasses. It is the heat of summer that defines our plant palette. That is the plants we use. And this is the heat zone map. Now, what I love about the heat zone map is we are also heat zones 8 and 9. That makes it so easy to remember. Hardiness zones 8 and 9, and heat zones 8 and 9. Here's Louisiana. Most of us are zone 9, and that means we're looking at, oh, I forget. It's like 160 days above 85 degrees every year. So that's where we are here in Louisiana. If we follow heat zone 9 around here, we see that we do see hot areas in the southwest, other than once we get up in the mountains. But then something bizarre happens as we reach the west coast. So we travel up the west coast to Seattle, we find that Seattle is in heat zone 2, and they have 1 to 7 days above 85 degrees every year. 1 to 7 days. Wouldn't that be wonderful? Makes me want to move there right now. And that's the difference. It isn't the cold that is the difference between Baton Rouge and Seattle. It is the heat that makes us so radically different from one another. So again, remember the heat is an important part of us gardening here. And there's a blow-up of the map showing a little zone 8 here and along the coast, but the majority of the state, zone 9. I mentioned that we'd be looking at quantity of light. And this is really important. Again, I've stressed to you now how important the relationship of plants is to light and how critically important it is to get the light right. Well, now we need to sort of look at how we would do that. The available light is highly variable in the landscape. You've got trees, buildings, hedges, all kinds of things are casting shadows in your landscape at various times during the day. Plants have particular light preferences, and they've got to be taken into consideration. If a plant likes it shady, you can't put it in the sun just because it looks good there. Evaluating light conditions in the landscape is critical to selecting the proper plants for a particular spot. Now, what that is implying is that, number one, you need to understand what kind of light the plant wants. Number two, and here's the kicker, you've got to know where that light exists in your landscape. So what oftentimes happens is that we go to the nursery, we find a neat little plant we want, we buy it, and before we leave we say, I haven't grown this before, what kind of light does it need? And the helpful staff person at the nursery says, oh, that plant likes partial shade. And you go, well, thank you very much, I appreciate that. As if you know what part shade means, as if the person telling you that actually knows what part shade really means. And then when you get home with it, the only way that that information can help you is if you know precisely where conditions of part shade exist in your landscape. If you don't know where part shade is, because you don't know what part shade, if you don't know where it exists, because you don't know what it is, then how does that information help you? How does it, so we fool ourselves sometimes. Oh, I know everything. I'm finding a light plant like. So here, let me help you through that some. The only way you're going to learn the light conditions of your landscape is to study it. Now, I don't mean take a year off from your life to evaluate the light through a year, because the light changes through an entire year. And walk around every day for 8 hours with a notebook noting where it's shady and where it's sunny. Now, if you did that for a year, you'd have a pretty good map of the light conditions in your landscape, but that is not practical. But what you can do is when you're weeding a flower bed, you can look around at 2 o'clock in the afternoon and say at 2 o'clock in the afternoon at the end of July, it's shady in this area and sunny in that area. When you're washing dishes, you can look out the window and say, here at 6 o'clock in the evening in August, it's shady over there and it's sunny over there. When you drive into your driveway from running errands, don't just look around with purpose and say, well, here it is at the end of the day and I'm getting home and it's autumn. Where is it light and where it's shady? By looking at your landscape constantly and noting where it's shady and where it's light, you will begin to get a map in your brain. It'll just slowly begin to build up over time. But it takes that. You can't get up on a Saturday morning and want to go out and buy some pretty plants and look out and say, well, it's shady there, so I'll put shade-loving plants there, and it's sunny over there, so I'll put sun-loving plants over there. It just doesn't work that way. The cast iron plant is a poster child for full shade. Cast iron would prefer never to see the sun, ever to see the sun. And if you give it too much sun, it turns yellow. And I've had so many people when I've recommended cast iron as a great, tough, resilient plant for deeply shaded areas. Oh, I don't like that. It always looks terrible. It's yellow and brown. And it is when it's planted in the sun. And when I say in the sun, I don't mean sun all day. I mean sun for a couple of hours even. It's just not a plant that likes to be in much sun. That's a very good point. So here are the definitions. If you wondered what these words actually meant, quantitatively, this is what they mean. A shady area, if a plant's recommended for shade, that means it prefers about 2 hours of direct morning sun or dappled light through the day. So remember, shade preference doesn't mean it likes it dark. Shade-loving plants do appreciate some direct sun in the morning or a lot of great dappled light through the day. Part shade, which has a lot of kinship with shade, these two light exposures share a lot of plants. A lot of plants can be planted in shade to part shade. So we have part shade, about 4 hours of direct morning sun. Plants that like part shade want their direct sun in the cooler morning hours when the temperatures are not so stressful. So if a plant is recommended for part shade, focus on morning sun for that plant. An eastern exposure would be perfect because it would get sun in the morning, and then as the sun crossed the sky, it would become shaded. A part sun would be 4 to 6 hours of direct sun, and plants that like part sun do well with a western exposure. Even though it's about the same number of hours as an eastern exposure, plants on the west side of objects get the sun in the hot, stressful afternoon hours, and so it is not equivalent. So even though an eastern exposure and a western exposure get about the same number of hours of direct sun during the day, they are not equivalent. And plants that like part shade will oftentimes do poorly in part sun because the conditions are too harsh and stressful for them. Finally, plants that like full sun need 8 hours or more of direct sun. That is 8 hours or more with the sun shining directly in an area. Now, the time is cumulative. It could be 2 hours and then an hour of shade, and then another 3 hours and an hour of shade. It builds up. It's kind of like you snacking during the day. You know, you may not want to believe it, but every calorie counts. Every one of those little calories you snacked on adds up to the end of the day. Same thing here. Every time the direct sun shines on the plant, it's getting direct sun, and that's cumulative. The compass directions help us in this because the sun always rises in the east, always sets in the west, and because we're perched up here in the northern hemisphere and the sun is tilted slightly on its axis, when we look across the solar system at the sun always appears in the southern part of our sky. So when you watch the sun go across the sky, it never crosses directly overhead and it never crosses to the north. It always crosses in the southern part of our sky. So given that's how the sun moves, the southern side of objects is the sunniest side. The sunniest side of a building is the south side. The sunniest side of a wall is the south side. The sunniest side of a tree is the south side. So the south side of any large object casting shadows is the sunniest side. A western exposure is part sun. An eastern exposure is part shade. And because the sun stays in the southern part of the sky, shadows are cast to the north. Objects will cast their shadows to the north. And so the northern exposure is shady, is the shadiest exposure. So here's some ways that you can evaluate the light in your landscape a little bit more easily. Any questions on light? Quantities, qualities, duration? Have I explained it so incredibly well that there just aren't any questions? All right, soil. Again, we have a huge amount of control over soil when we're planting into beds. Now, we plant shrubs, vegetables, flowers, ground covers. We plant almost everything into beds. And we have the ability to radically change the soil in that planting area or that bed. We have the option of even bringing in soil and laying it on top and planting in that soil, abandoning the native soil altogether and planting into a soil mix that we might bring in. But when it comes to trees, trees grow by themselves in the native soil. And so when it comes to trees, you must choose trees that are going to be happy with the soil that they're going to be growing in, the pH, the texture, and all of that. And trees are resilient. I've had people say, I want to plant some trees, but this soil is so bad, I don't think anything is going to grow here. And I'll ask, well, are there any trees in your neighborhood or area? Oh, yeah. There are trees all over my neighborhood. Well, then trees will grow in that soil. What are you worried about? So again, trees can grow in all kinds of soil, but they have to grow in the native soil. We don't pamper them. We don't put stuff in the hole with them. When you have your tree lecture, you'll hear about planting trees, but they have to grow in the native soil. Factors include drainage. Plants that like good drainage will not grow where there's poor drainage. Plants that like poor drainage will do perfectly well there. So drainage is not a problem. You just have to choose plants that are going to do well. The pH, how acid or alkaline the soil is, how much organic matter is in the soil. These are all factors that are important. Don't forget, whenever you're evaluating soil, trying to decide how you might need to change it, how do you know what kind of fertilizer to use on your plants? Well, you think about what fertilizers are and what they do, and I've already told you. Fertilizers are materials that we add to the soil that provide one or more essential element, like nitrogen, phosphorus, or potassium, and we put it in the soil to correct deficiencies when there's not enough of those minerals in the soil. So how do we know when there's not enough of certain minerals in the soil? You can't look at it. You can't ask it. You can't ask the soil, well, how fertile are you today? You have to soil test. So the only way you can know the fertility of your soil, what mineral nutrients are there in adequate amounts, and what nutrients are there in inadequate amounts that need to be supplemented, is by a soil test. So you really cannot choose a fertilizer to fertilize your plants with until you know what nutrient levels are in your soil, and choose a fertilizer that emphasizes the minerals that are in short supply and doesn't have very much of the minerals that are in good supply. That's how you choose fertilizers. So don't forget, get your soil tested, find out what's high, medium, and low, and then choose fertilizers that provide the nutrients or don't, depending on where they are.